4 of 4, folks. This is the last time I'm going to mention being on time because the goal was to make sure I had an episode out each week for 4 weeks. And we've done that as of today. So yay for me. I hope you're all cheering. I hope you're all happy. I know I'm happy that I've gotten the consistency. Next task, let's see if we can do it for 4 more weeks. Anyways, this week, we're going to talk about the constant issues with Boeing and their 737s and relate that to why American excellence, exceptionalism, quality, what have you, is slipping, and how that further degrades the stature of the United States on the world stage. We'll also talk about how this is a sign of a deeper issue in America. I know, as usual, there will be those listening who will call me to task and say, "There never says such a thing as American exceptionalism." And I will kindly point out several things that did come from America during the 20th century, for good or ill, that the world adopted en masse and enjoyed, and it didn't come from anywhere else but the United States. Some of these things are the telephone, the internet, Coca-Cola, Hollywood movies, and ironically today's episode, the airplane. Good or bad, for the longest time, Americans were thought of as the good guys and having the best products, best ideas, and best systems. History hasn't always been too kind to the United States, and current events even less so. But right now, it seems that the United States is in a steep slide to mediocrity, so much so that even the United Nations is worried about it. Now, to appease my more liberal listeners, I do want to say something important here before I move on. When I complain about the United States, it's because I was raised to love the United States and to believe that she could do no wrong. Education, observation, and experience on my part have greatly changed my view, but my disappointment in America stems from my earlier love affair with America and my disappointment in her, like a child who's flunked math because he'd rather stay up and play video games instead of study. There really isn't a good reason for the issue America faces now besides corporate greed, partisan politics, and people who want to live in the good old days of 1776, but yet still want to keep sanitation, flush toilets, and the Super Bowl. Go figure. What I'm trying to say here is I want things to change, and of course I want the U.S. to be the best, because that's the American way. But what's going on right now? What's going on with the United States? This ain't it. Today's episode is going to touch on quite a few topics, but the best place to start is always with a little background and a poster child. And today, that poster child is actually Boeing. Little backstory, a little history here. Boeing is an old company that was incorporated in 1934, even though it started quite a few years before incorporation. Now, interesting side note here, if you're interested in history. Boeing's first engineer was named Wang Su, and he was a Chinese graduate of MIT and was hired by Boeing in 1916. Remember, I said the history of Boeing goes back further than when it was actually incorporated. He designed the Boeing Model 2, which was the first financial success that Boeing had. File that information however you will. I'll file it under American success has always been a multicultural affair, even if certain people want to say that it was a white America that made America great. There's some truth to that, but not in the way that you think. Anyways, Boeing, in the years after World War I, used its aircraft mostly for the U.S. mail service and U.S. naval training aircraft. However, where Boeing really started to cut its teeth was in the 1940s, with it making great strides in technology because of being one of the primary providers of military aircraft during World War II. Some of the designs that Boeing created during World War II are still used today in the U.S. Air Force, albeit with updated systems and technology, of course. The B-52 bomber is the most notable of these aircraft. However, after World War II, Boeing became shut out of the commercial aircraft market, with the first commercial jet airliner being the United Kingdom's de Havilland Comet in 1952. Unfortunately, due to metal fatigue, which was something that really wasn't understood at the time, 3 Comets were lost in their first year of commercial flights. And now another interesting tidbit, it is because of the de Havilland Comet that all windows on today's airplanes are curved. It was discovered that having square windows caused more metal fatigue and stress fractures in the skin of the aircraft, eventually causing catastrophic decompression. If you like aviation or engineering like I do, look up the history of de Havilland's Comet and what they did to figure out the mystery of the exploding airplanes. It's really interesting and clever how they came to the source of the problem. Anyways, back to the Boeing story. As you know, one man's loss is another man's gain, or in this case, company gain. The crashes of the Comet put Boeing back on the map as a, if not the prominent leader in commercial jet manufacturing. And with Boeing introducing the 707, the rest, as they say, is history. Now, as the years pass, Boeing expanded by buying up other aviation companies or parts manufacturers. This isn't to say there wasn't scandals along the way, but for the most part, there was goodwill towards Boeing. Boeing got more military and space contracts and expanded upon its commercial jet offerings. Airlines around the world were buying Boeings to expand their commercial fleets, but besides gas prices in the Vietnam War, Boeing was doing okay. And when they introduced the Boeing 737 in 1967, that model became the best-selling commercial jet aircraft in aviation history. The 737 MAX, which is what we're discussing tonight, which is in the news all the time these days, that's the direct descendant of the original 737, just with updated technology and improved materials, of course. Once the Boeing 747 came out in 1970, that became yet another game changer in aviation. A jetliner was now able to fly further and with more people. This further increased Boeing's worldwide status, and Boeing's economic fortunes improved with more military projects and orders. It wasn't until the late 1990s when the joint European company Airbus, which you may be familiar with, started to present some real competition to Boeing. Now, I can hear you saying, "Yo, Tech, what's up with this aviation history and what does it have to do with you bitching about American clout? You're always bitching about America. What's this about tonight?" Okay. We're starting to get into that now, and here's where I'm going to expand upon this and talk about the change in relationship between American workers and corporate America. Sure, stakeholders and company owners have always been trying to increase profits and decrease what they owed their workers. However, there was also a time when owners realized they had to at least seem like they cared about their workers and provide benefits and more than just lip service. They had to convince everyone down to the janitor that they were an important part of the company and part of the greater mission of the company and that they were valued. This needed to happen for a few reasons. One, at the beginning of the 20th century, with all the new technologies coming into play as a result of the Industrial Revolution, there were more jobs in manufacturing, which, and as a byproduct, made more jobs out of supporting industries like the service industry. But because of the expanding goods and services that were out there, it made it, up until the Great Depression, relatively easy to find another job if the one you had didn't work out. A good fiction book, based on fact that I would recommend for you to read about this time, is Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. It's actually an absolute favorite book of mine since, I want to say, grade school, because I had a really high reading ability early, but maybe it wasn't in high school. The time doesn't matter. I really recommend the book. However, I don't recommend the super socialist original draft version of the book. That one had been repressed because it was too on the nose socialist. I'm not telling you not to read that one because I'm trying to ingrain capitalism in you, even though in fact I am a capitalist. But because the point about socialism is so heavy-handed in the last third version of that book, it's actually really insufferable. The original published version of Upton Sinclair, The Jungle gets the point across just as well, and it was bad enough that it caused changes in the U.S. meat processing industry, which are still in place today and woefully need to be updated, but that's another topic for another day. In Upton Sinclair's book, you will see how easy it is for a worker to quit or be fired from one job and just find another. This is how things were during the Gilded Age in the early 20th century. The problem with this then, as it is now, is when you lose a worker, you lose institutional knowledge as well as the investment in training in said worker, and possibly trade secrets getting out to your competitors. You can see where this is something that companies were worried about even as far back as in the 1880s, when George Pullman built Pullmantown in Chicago as a place for his workers to live, even though they had to pay rent to the Pullman Company for their digs. The homes and services that the Pullman Company built for its workers provided a lot of amenities that most of the housing at the time didn't have, such as indoor plumbing, gas hookups, and sewers. Because of this, the workers at the Pullman Company were quite loyal and felt that the Pullman Company was looking out for them because their standard of living was better than, say, working at another company. This helped with employee retention and happiness until the Depression of 1893, when profits for the Pullman Company began to slack, and because of this, wages plummeted, and because of that, layoffs increased. Finally, the workers initiated a strike, and that ended up getting the federal government involved in order to end the strike with the Pullman factory. I don't want to really go too much into it. It's a really interesting story about Pullman Town in Chicago, and maybe I'll do a whole series on Chicago stories, but that's another thing to kind of keep in mind, as I go on tonight talking about Boeing and companies and etc. But anyways, and keep Pullman Company in mind. There were still lessons learned from what Pullman Company did, and as well as some holdovers from medieval times and how serfs were treated by lords for a lifetime of service. Companies realized a few things. Quality of product and retention really does depend on the happiness of the employees, and the employee happiness is directly based on the perception that the employer cares, but making the employee feel like a contributor to the success of the company, to feel they are part of the extended family of the company, and for the company to provide appropriate compensation, perks, and benefits for employment and years of service. Again, I'm going to ask you to remember my little story about Pullman Town later. So let's get back to Boeing. Working at Boeing had cachet. It was a big deal to have a job at Boeing. Employees were working on world-famous airplanes with cutting-edge technology that had a dominant share of the international market. It was a good job with benefits and a pension. A job you might try to stay in until retirement if you didn't get laid off before then, when Boeing was having one of its several economic downturns. It was a really good job to have until it wasn't. As I stated earlier, Boeing had some periodic issues with profitability. These started to resolve themselves in the 1980s, but the 1980s is also where the dynamic between companies and the relationship between their customers, employees, and shareholders began to change in the United States. This was due to a lot of changes in both tax law and labor laws of the United States. We have Reagan to thank for a lot of that. The 80s was the beginning of the push for less company benefits, less pensions, and the breaking up of unions. Value to shareholders start to become more important than value to the customer even, and even less than value to employees. Pensions begin to fade with the push of the self-directed 401k, which took the onus of retirement planning off of the corporation and put it squarely on the employee. You were no longer guaranteed a pension in retirement for years of service. You put money into the 401k, and the company would match it to a certain extent, which means that if the company didn't have a really good year, they didn't have to match or put funds into the 401k. They didn't have to, by having 401ks and not pensions, companies didn't have to worry about future funding the retirements of older workers by managing corporate profits. And as I said, they could just not contribute to an employee's retirement plan at all if the company expressed failing profits for that year. Parts of a business were carved out and offshored if labor prices or materials shipping was cheaper. People lost jobs. So bit by bit, that family feeling between employees and corporations begins to fade. Employees are still working the same amount of hours for less benefits, and the salaries are not keeping up with increases to the cost of living. Add to this specifically in the case of Boeing, complacency starts to set in. Boeing is now the almost de facto contractor to the U.S. military. They're getting the vast majority of aviation orders around the world and other orders for space. The due diligence inspecting work or not controlling the total chain of custody in work products, so the things that they make, are being outsourced. Remember this later. This begins to breed in some bad habits at Boeing. Add into this the coziness of Boeing with the Federal Aviation Administration, and Boeing be allowed to self-audit and self-police its manufacturing airworthiness tests, without any oversight from the FAA, then there was a slew of accidents waiting to happen. Finally, we come to the late 1980s, 1990s. Think of the WorldCom scandals. Think of a lot of these corporate scandals that start coming into play because of manipulation of stocks and books. The idea of bringing in profit by manipulating the stock market prices with the use of share buybacks inflates the worth of a company, and it gives it access to better loans and better loan terms. And this is what Boeing did. At this point, we now have set the stage for the perfect storm. We have business managers running projects who understand how to make money by cutting project timelines and therefore coming in under budget. However, don't know the right questions to ask and how to get an airplane to fly. They're running these projects instead of engineers who understand how avionics and aviation works. We also have an increasingly unengaged workforce and a cozy relationship with the federal government. This provided a lot more value to existing shareholders by cutting production costs and therefore increasing profits. But we finally see all this come to a head with the two Boeing 737 MAX aircraft crashes in 2018 and 19 that took the lives of 346 people, and the recent door blowout in a flight because of a quality issue with the door plug. Both of these incidents could have been resolved if the company had listened to their workers, the engineers, over listening to the shareholders. Side note here about the shareholders. Before the plug in the door of the 737 MAX failed this year in 2024, there were some shareholders for a sub-company that Boeing had given a subcontractor the work to make the actual bolts and parts for that door. And they had been in trouble with the FAA for several years for quality control issues. And shareholders were actually suing that company before this even happened because of quality control issues. You would think Boeing would have been checking even harder the materials that were coming from this company. But as you can see, we have a lot of siloing of roles and responsibilities when we have companies offshoring and outsourcing certain parts of their manufacturing to other companies. That's what I'm talking about, chain of control of the product, because now we have more parts. We have the same amount of parts in different places with different teams, and it becomes a lot harder for oversight to happen. And so that's why I'm bringing that up. Either way, these things do nothing to help the morale of the workers at Boeing. And now Boeing, which is a huge moneymaker for the United States, has lost respect and revenue to Airbus, who is taking advantage of the misfortunes of Boeing. And they may actually be starting to pull ahead in new aircraft orders due to the mistrust of Boeing products. Sound familiar? Remember de Havilland's comment? Anyways, American quality gets called further into question because of Boeing. The world begins to further question America and American products when a major aircraft manufacturer has been exposed for so many stupid mistakes that could have been avoided with the proper oversight instead of a goal of massive profit. A manufacturer that has thousands of lives in its hand every day as people fly around the globe using Boeing aircraft. Now, I want to pivot in this episode for a little bit to bring in some of the other ideas that I mentioned at the start. I just spent, almost 20 minutes talking about the history of Boeing and the history of employment post the Industrial Revolution and turn of the century. After World War II, jobs in America exploded and unions were far stronger. There were still pensions and gold watches for retirement. There was still that mentality that if you worked hard, you'd be compensated well and appreciated by your employer. Everything was in place to make you work hard and to give you that pride in your job and your product. And you're more likely to get that house and that new car until things begin to get chipped away in the 80s. And that relationship between company-employee begins to sour. Sure, people have bitched about their jobs since forever. I mean, remember Ralph Cramden. But people haven't worried about owning a home or having enough money for retirement until really the 90s. That contract between employee and employer begins to fracture. Unions became the weakest they have ever been in America, and unless you were a public service employee, the likelihood of you having a pension just wasn't there. Time staying in one company also dramatically decreased from the 1940s. In the 1940s, people tended to stay at one employer for 10 to 15 years. Let me repeat that. Staying at one employer for 10 to 15 years, that's like mind-boggling to me at this point. By the time we get to the 1980s, that time has decreased to 3 to 7 years. 7 years is mind-boggling to me. However, by the time we get to now, the time has become 2 to 3 years between employers. People need a job hop in order to increase compensation, and since there are less benefits for employees, there is less loyalty to the companies. I do want to back up for a moment, and I want to remind you of one outlier from the 90s. And I hope you still remember what I told you about the Pullman Company in Pullman Town. The tech companies of the 90s, such as Meta, Amazon, and especially Google, learned a thing or two from the past when it came to attracting and retaining employees. Google especially became a poster child of really good compensation with tons of perks such as free lunch and dinner, yoga and jujitsu on campus, free snacks, sleeping pods, and free laundry. To the wide-eyed 20-year-old, this seems like a really good deal, and in some aspects it was, but there was a method to this madness. I actually was asked to interview with Google in the early 2000s, I think it was. No, mid 2000s I was asked, and whenever I was in my 30s, and I saw right through it right then and there. And I was actually interviewed by Google twice, and I said no twice just because I saw there was no work-life balance, which is what I'm saying to 20-year-olds. It sounds great, but the reason why Google has all these perks is to get people to stay in the office and work more instead of having a real true work-life balance. The tech culture that arises during the 90s introduces hustle culture, which starts to creep in. And it becomes the only way to get ahead is to go full bore until you absolutely must sleep, and then you do drugs to try to keep up now. That's fading a little bit, but there's still some real vestiges of that tech bro culture in technology still. However, as I said, we start to see this all start to come crashing down in 2019, 2020 when COVID hit. So here's where I'm going to tie in Boeing to the general state of the workforce and the loss of American excellence and why Americans should be concerned. When COVID came into play, two key things happened. One, Gen Z begins to enter the workforce. And two, millennials and Gen X realize how much they have been shafted when it came to working. Let's start with millennials and Gen X. These two groups were forced to work from home unless they performed a job in the service or restaurant industry. What Gen Z and millennials saw was that they could just be as productive from home and regain some sort of work-life balance. Companies were also upping compensation to not lose talent that they needed to adopt their companies to this new remote working environment. Some say they overhired, and that might have been true, but the compensation got a lot better. Most people still weren't making enough to afford a home easily, but at this time, the interest rates were low enough to tempt a lot of people into the housing market that otherwise would have stayed out. Others moved to places that were cheaper to live away from cities and tech hubs while keeping those big city salaries, which in the city isn't really a big salary. In addition, the stock market still boomed and people were just a little bit happier. It was depressing to be at home, that's to be sure, but there was a lot of posting about being happier to work from home and being able to have more time to do the things that you cared about. The second thing that comes into play here is Gen Z comes into the workforce. And I've spoken about Gen Z on other podcasts before. And I'm not going to bash Gen Z all the time because Gen Z actually has some really good ideas that the older generations have actually adopted when it comes to work-life balance, but there is a limit to this, being that Gen Z is nothing like the workers that came before them. Work-life balance is more important to them than anything else. I mean, they've seen their parents and the state of the world and the economy as they grew up. They've seen at this point in time 1 or 2 recessions, 3 maybe. To them, the immediate right here, right now seems to be more important than what's going to happen 40 years from now, because they really don't have a positive outlook on the future to begin with. They really don't want to take on positions of responsibility because it might disrupt time for their personal passions. Work is something they do to get paid. Work isn't who they are, and they are very suspicious of the worker corporation dynamic after seeing so many layoffs and what their parents went through. It's also in the last 3 to 4 years we start to see the terms such as quiet quitting enter the lexicon. People only doing the bare minimum to keep their job because they realize that their employer doesn't really care about them and will fire them at a moment's notice if it appeases the shareholders. Nowhere in any of this do you hear about going above and beyond or feeling connected to your workplace or your work. Not like boomers. And even though work-life balance is important, this is also kind of a problem because if you're just there to get paid, then you're doing the bare minimum and not necessarily your best work. This affects quality because nobody's engaged enough anymore to take that extra step or really care. They don't necessarily want to innovate. China actually is suffering from a similar mindset right now as the US for actually similar reasons, but their work-life balance is way worse in America. However, a lot of the rest of the world is not suffering from these things, and because of that, they are beginning to nip on the toes of America. Now, what I've just spoken about is the past, the here and the now, and some of the way past. But there are also alarm bells for the future in the past. American children keep ranking further and further behind their international peers in academics, especially when it comes to math and science. This is a huge problem because the majority of innovations that America is known for have come from STEM. STEM being science, technology, engineering, and mathematics for those of you who don't know what STEM is. It takes smart people to create new ideas and technologies, but when education in the U.S. has become second nature, or second rate to whether or not we teach how bad slavery was in American schools, every American suffers. The educational standards of the U.S. are based on partisan politics more than what is good for the competitiveness of the United States in the future. Countries that were once considered third world backwaters to the United States are having their kids run circles around their American counterparts. It's actually becoming harder for Americans to find jobs outside the United States once they graduate because our education system is putting them behind graduates from Europe and Asia. So now we have a broken social contract. We have apathy in the workforce, and we have poor education in the United States. This creates a trifecta of doom and a decrease in innovation and quality in American products and technology. It's just a natural thing that's going to happen. It's actually no wonder that Boeing is having issues, but Boeing is actually just the tip of the iceberg. The question is this fixable? Can we fix it? I like to believe that anything is fixable if everyone comes to the table and listens as much as they speak and are willing to make compromises. The problem with the United States is that it has become so polarized, as I said earlier, which is, by the way, why the UN or United Nations is so worried about the United States. These conversations are not happening. The wrong conversations are happening over esoteric ideas on what it means to be American, when ironically, what it means to be American, as we are taught in America, is to be exceptional, innovative, and good. Again, I'm speaking from an American perspective about how we're taught. I understand and somewhat agree to those of you who aren't jiving on what I'm saying right now or who aren't American. This part of the conversation is not for you. This is for my fellow Americans. Moving right along. For the longest time, too long actually, corporations have had an inordinate amount of sway over the federal government, and they have not been taxed or held accountable for their actions that hurt people and the environment. Too long have elected officials been bought by special interests, and again, corporations end up snagging any real change to how we do things in the United States. Too long, Americans have held on to the idea that the Constitution is unchangeable and that a two-party system is the way to go. Too long have states' rights been able to overthrow the wishes of the federal government. let me put this in perspective for you. This year, the United States will be 238 years old, which is a heck of a lot younger than our European counterparts, but is pretty dang old. We're still doing things the exact same way we did back in 1776. We're still discussing the right to own guns from a law made when you had to go grab your musket, fill it with powder, tamp it down, and then add your shot bullets before you could fire it. We want to apply those ideals to an AR-15 that can shoot 45 rounds per minute. A musket with a skilled rifleman can only fire 4 rounds per minute. There is all this die-hard clutching of pearls over progress that is natural as a society evolves, and that's what's actually killing American progress, because we refuse to progress. With that in mind, we need to revisit the change in laws in the 1980s, which made it easier for corporations to go with the 401k instead of pensions, made it easier for corporations to bust unions, easier for corporations to make money on tax savings by moving money around instead of actually producing quality products that people want to buy. And let me clear that for a second. Due to consolidation and monopoly in the market, the consumer has less power with their dollars than they did before, which allows corporations to keep up with the bad behavior. We have got to change the education system. There needs to be better universal standards in education and real positive consequences for exceeding in studies. And finally, we have to give people a real pathway to feeling secure and fulfilled in their roles and work, and have a real voice where they work and really feel like they're part of the company, instead of just serfs working for the land of their lord. Then and only then might we be able to turn this American ship around. Unfortunately, we're in another election cycle in the United States, and whereas I do understand what Biden is doing for education and what he has done, I have yet to see the actual word education come out of Trump's lips. And I mention Trump again because unfortunately, especially with the recent caucuses, unless he gets thrown in jail or told he can't run by the Supreme Court, highly unlikely in my opinion, I fear he will be the Republican nominee again. I haven't heard about total tax reform that includes citizens as well as corporations, and I haven't heard anything about how to address retirement shortfalls in the citizens in general. I have heard a lot about drag queens in library, sexual assault and fraud cases, and I've heard a lot of what I'm always going to say, like a broken record, aliens, because aliens are going to help Johnny not flunk algebra, I guess. And finally, I am totally at a loss as how to get the younger generation engaged and more excited instead of trying to become more like social media influencers. The sad fact is that if you make it as a social media influencer, you're more likely to make enough money for the down payment of a home than if you're a middle manager at a company these days. And that's just the truth. So with all of this, Boeing becomes probably the canary in the coal mine, and is a sad tale that leads down to a dark rabbit hole of why things are the way they are and why something needs to be done before it's too late. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned a little bit about history and aviation along with my usual rantings. As usual, I'll put my research notes in the end of the podcast. I'm not entirely sure what we will be talking about next week, as I actually could continue more along the lines about education in the United States, and from a business perspective, a business and technical perspective, why agile thinking, which has been all the rage in corporate America but might be petering off a little while now, is one of the big reasons why consumers are increasingly becoming guinea pigs to not fully tested or vetted products for the sake of cost savings to the corporations. Stuff you might not be aware of if you're not on the business or technical side of corporate America. Or I might discuss how sick I am of seeing Kanye West's newest wife naked all the time. I am really sick of that. I'm not slut shaming. A woman should be able to wear what she wants to wear, but my God, am I sick of seeing her titties. You never know. The week is still young. I'm also mulling an idea about doing a series about the history of Chicago. You know, the city that America loves to hate, the city that I'm from. And when I say history, I don't necessarily mean rattling off a bunch of dates of Chicago was, created in the year, so it sounds like a book report. I don't necessarily want to do that. but I might want to like to talk about why things are the way they are in Chicago, how we got to where we are in Chicago, and why everyone loves to pick on the city. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Chicago and not understanding of why Chicago is set up the way that it is and has the issues that it does. I mean, I don't know. I would love to hear your feedback on how you felt about this episode, how you felt about the past episodes, or whatever you're interested in getting my take on. You know, what would you like for me to talk about in an episode? The floor is yours, is what I'm saying. This is, as I said earlier, the 4th episode of It's Complicated. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, thumbs up, spread the word. Especially if you're listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe and thumbs up. Every like and subscription helps to hopefully get some funding for me doing this down the road. If you really like the show, there is now a Patreon up, as I said I would do if I could make it past week 4. The link for that is also in the notes of this podcast. Once again, I thank you for listening and spending this time with me. I really do appreciate the support. And I'm probably going to say this every week, but again, do me a favor this week. Do or say something nice to someone. Even if the smallest thing. Even if you have to tell somebody you like their sweater because they have a cool sweater. Tell them. Because I promise you that one small, nice thing will make their day as well as yours. Until next week, thanks again for listening. Bye.